Last week I talked about the idea that we as human beings began with this concept that has come down through the ages to be called God or Spirit or the mystical or the creative power, whatever you want to call it. We first looked out at the heavens, our ancestors did, and said basically, who lights the stars? And I think we can all relate to that idea of being completely mystified by what shows up in this universe, and it's something that speaks to each and every one of us. You know, who lights that beautiful sunset? Who lights that beautiful sunrise? Who lights the stars? What is it that brings forth the beautiful flowers and the diversity in this world? And, you know, just the joy of life that springs forward all around us. And in a way, I would argue that maybe that's a spiritual question. It's all spiritual. But I mean, in a way, it's also kind of a scientific question. It's kind of the question that we as little kids ask because we're just so blown away by what's around us, and it's hard for us to articulate, and our imagination goes wild. I would argue, though, that over time, there became a second question that we asked. So we started out with who lights the stars, and then we moved into a second question. Once we began to toy with the idea of what do we call this power? What is this power? Then we got into the idea of, does Spirit love me? Does Spirit want to help me? Does Spirit want me to thrive? Is Spirit my light of wisdom? Will Spirit give me a hand? Will Spirit illumine my path? Will Spirit provide me with peace? Charles Darwin stepped onto the research vessel, the Beagle, in Great Britain in the early part of the 1800s, the 19th century. And he was a scientist, he was a biologist. He was someone who was never real comfortable with formal education. He didn't do real well in formal education. He really felt himself being called out into the world. So he landed this position on the Beagle, and the idea of evolution was already kind of circulating among a lot of the scientific community at that time, the academics, and he was one of them. And it wasn't so much that they stood on the platform and said, this is it. I mean, they wondered about it, they thought about it, they asked questions about it, and they went out into the world. And very much, I think the same way, you know, what is it that lights the stars? What is it that brings forward life? So as we all know, Darwin eventually ended up, after a very long voyage, at the Galapagos Islands. And during the time that the Beagle was away from Great Britain doing all this research throughout the western part of the world, he was harvesting specimens. He was harvesting all kinds of flora and fauna and biological life of all kinds. And back in those days, they didn't really have a way to bring anything back alive, so unfortunately they were harvesting it and they were preserving it as best they could. Now, Darwin was a guy who believed, he was mainly interested in geography as a young scientist. And he believed that if this idea of evolution really exists, what it means basically is that if I find myself as a species in some geographical place and I want to thrive, then I will adapt to that environment so that I can thrive. So he was out there, and he was kind of, you know, his way of looking into the world was kind of from that point of view. Although he did his job, he harvested his specimens, he did all that, but he sort of looked at things from that way of seeing the world. So he went to the Galapagos along with other places, and he harvested some plants, he harvested birds, he harvested some animals, they harvested some fish, and he makes the trip all the way back to England, and he shows up one day to deliver all of his specimens to the Geographical Society. And we've all heard of Charles Darwin, but I'm not sure how many of us have heard of a gentleman by the name of John Gould, who was an ornithologist. And so Darwin came all the way back from the Galapagos, that long trip back, brought forward all his specimens, and a gentleman by the name of John Gould was part of the panel of scientists who received the specimens. And John Gould was interested in all the birds that he brought back. Now, Darwin had harvested a whole bunch of birds, and one of them didn't exactly look like this. I harvested this at Michael's. So there were a number of birds that all looked very, very similar, almost identical, and he harvested dozens of them, and they would be called later on Darwin's finches. And the reason they were called Darwin's finches is because Darwin really didn't know what he had, and so he hands them over, and John Gould looked them over for the next few weeks. And when Darwin came back to see what the Geographical Society thought of his stuff, John Gould pulled him aside. He said, "Do you know what you have here?" And Darwin said, "Well, I think it's a finch." He said, "Yeah, I mean, actually it wasn't a finch, but they were called Darwin's finches. And they were probably smaller than this and darker. But John Gould pointed out to him that all these birds that at first glance looked identical to each other were actually, he could break them into 4 what he called subspecies. And the difference in them is their beaks. In the beak sizes and shape ranged to an incredible amount from one end to the other. From a very large beak that was almost took up the full front of the finch's face down to a tiny beak, kind of like the one this guy has. So John Gould said these finches, or these birds, appear to be absolutely identical except for their beaks. He said, so why do you suppose they have different beaks? And so Darwin, who only spent in his whole life 5 weeks at the Galapagos, in his whole life, he said, well, I'm not really sure, but I would assume that they were probably maybe feeding differently or whatever. And so John Gould said, if the basis of evolution were solely on the idea of a geographical place, then why wouldn't their beaks be identical? And so at that moment, Charles Darwin and John Gould peered down into this beautiful little child of God and said, wow, something else is going on here. In other words, now this is the spiritual question. Did this little guy one day decide that it wanted to have a different experience than all of its brothers and sisters? And Darwin and Gould looked down at this little bird and said, oh my God, this changes the whole game. This means that once upon a time, something happened. Could we call it choice? Can we call it consciousness? Can we call it, I want a different experience? It's really interesting in Charles Darwin's work later on, this is how he spoke of his finches. Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related groups of birds, one might really fancy that from an original scarcity of birds in this large group of islands, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. One species had been taken and modified for different ends. That's amazing. And that put the entire scientific community on its heels. Darwin's finches. There have been many, many books written on simply Darwin's finches. Little birds that were smaller than this, probably closer to the size of those. And the entire world of the scientific community took note of these finches and basically, in essence, tried to peer down into them and say, what is your secret? Now, this is really amazing because we start off with the idea of what lights the stars. And religiously and spiritually, we've been looking up there ever since, and we created this whole paradigm about heaven and the angels and all this stuff, and God is up there somewhere. This power that transforms, this power that creates, this power that is in the universe, and we've been really busy looking up there somewhere, looking beyond the stars, looking to the heavens. And all of these mythologies have come about, biblical mythologies and all kinds of other writings, and nearly every culture in this world looked out there, looked beyond, looked, in this idea of duality. I am here and it is there. And suddenly there are two men standing in Great Britain looking down there. And I say, being someone who is more interested in the spiritual realm, I say that instead of looking out there, is it possible we need to look down here? What's really interesting is that Darwin spent only 5 weeks in the Galapagos in his entire life. John Gould never set foot in the place. I don't know if Gould ever left Great Britain. I'm not really sure. But many years later, there is a biological team of Peter and Rosemary Grant who have been making research trips to the Galapagos on a regular basis for over 30 years. And one of the things that they love to do is they love to watch Darwin's finches. And so they sit and they watch. Now there is a cactus in the Galapagos, which is it's sort of the center of life in a way. It's sort of like the safe way of the Galapagos Islands for everything that lives there. It is its fruit and its flowers and its pulp and the insects that are attracted to it is the center of where a lot of life comes to feed. And Darwin's finches are right in the middle of all that. And so they watched Darwin's finches, and they found out that these different beak sizes and shapes enabled these different birds, we say different because of the beak size, to participate with the cactus in different ways. And so each of them is able to access different parts of the flowers, the fruit, the flesh, and the insects differently than its brothers and sisters. So basically, once upon a time, what this says is that there were some finches lined up on a fence post somewhere, and one of them looked at that cactus and really wanted to have a different experience. Another finch looked at that cactus and said it wanted to have a different experience. And a third and a fourth. I want to have a different experience. Ernest Holmes talks about in his work that life shows up to us in the way that we experience it. Life shows up to us in the way that we experience it. And so these finches, as I was talking about before, and using the example of our board, these finches stepped forward and stood in an intention to have a different and a unique and authentic experience. And what happened? What happened? There is a power, there is an energy for good in this universe that we can use. And so, when we look at how it is that we want our beak to look, when we look at how it is that we want to experience the cactus, then we come forward in this idea of, how can I bring this experience forward? You see, when the finches did this, basically we believe that there was a power in the universe, call it God, call it spirit, call it whatever. It's not up there. It's ever present. And it basically says, okay, let's do that. Let's have that experience. And so basically, like the finches, we are, in all of life, And this is what, Darwin was one of the pioneers of understanding, is that all of life, basically what Darwin and what John Gould came up with is, at some level, this beautiful little bird was interacting with God. Not in a church, not in a temple. It didn't bend its little knees and pray. It simply came into a place of knowing what it is that it wanted. It came into a place of being very clear about that experience. And so we come back to our original questions. And we say, does Spirit love me? Well, our definition of love in metaphysics and New Thought is, as I mentioned before, is love is Spirit's givingness to its creation. So if the finch says, am I loved? Then Spirit simply says, well, yeah, I'm showing up in the way that you want me to show up. Does God want to help me? God provides the energy that changes the beak, that changes the experience. Does God want me to thrive? One of the things that scientists have found is that these finches, no matter what group they belong to, they absolutely thrive. Is God my light of wisdom? Will God give me a hand? And we see in this experience that both the wisdom of God and the helping hand of God is there to enhance that experience. Will God illumine my path? Will God provide me with peace? I think that this is, will God provide me with peace, is the biggest one that I think as human beings that we all deal with all the time. We look at the world around us, what's happening, but we don't have to go any further than our own lives. And we look at the challenges in our own lives, the cactus, if you will. And we look at that cactus and we say, I would like to have a different experience. I would like to have a peaceful experience. I would like to have an authentic experience. Not can I or I wish. I would like to have. I would like to stand in that place. You see, basically, what I'm talking about today is that for Ernest Holmes, the idea of God, see, Ernest Holmes loved calling God all kinds of things. And so the idea of God for Ernest Holmes was also the word good. For Ernest Holmes, it wasn't that God was out there somewhere and God was this person or this place or this thing that we had to find. For Ernest Holmes, he said God is a good in which we can use. To open ourselves up and say, I know that my beak can be different. And I know that my experience with whatever cactus this is in my life can be a different experience. So basically we ask ourselves the question, one of the things that theology and religion has looked at for a long time, when the going gets tough and we say, is God going to show up? Ernest Holmes would basically say, God is already here. When the finches said, I wonder when the new beaks are going to show up, basically it was, God is already here. So this morning, while we contemplate this, I'd like to invite you to just take a moment to sit back, and if you're comfortable, close your eyes. And there's a Kathy Zavada song that I would like to play now for you to listen to.